Jim Murphy has stated he wants to reach out to Yes voters as he takes his new position as leader of the Scottish Labour Party. Meanwhile, a brand new alternative media service from the Commonweal launches. My name is Stephen Payton, and this is Left Scotland. It's been a while. The last show I put out was back on the 10th of December before going on a short hiatus over the Christmas and New Year period. And a lot has happened since then. For example, I got a new haircut, but also Jim Murphy was elected to the new head of the Scottish Labour Party. The immediate reaction was less than stellar, with Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite the Union, describing the election of Jim Murphy as a death sentence for the party, and Sarah Collins, a Unison trade unionist and former chair of the Scottish Trade Unions Congress Youth Committee, stating that following the referendum and Murphy's election, Labour have become the enemy for much of the working class in Scotland. As it stands, the SNP's trade union group alone now boasts more members than the entirety of the Scottish Labour Party, so it would seem that Murphy has his work cut out for him in the run-up to the general election. After being elected as the new Scottish Labour leader, surveyation polls showed that more people were actually less likely to vote Labour following his appointment. This is no doubt because Murphy represents a further swing to the right on the Labour Party, so much so that during his election campaign to be Scottish Labour leader, Conservative activists such as Sarah Robb here were actually volunteering in call centres to help get Murphy into power. In fact, that mentality continues on, with right-wing and Conservative activists and journalists arguing that Labour and the Conservatives should continue to work together to stop the SNP. Alan Cochrane in The Telegraph argues that Labour should reach out to its heartlands to stop the SNP. Fraser Nelson in The Spectator says that he would rather spend a lifetime in a Labour-run Britain than a day in a country with the SNP in power. And Effie Deans of Think Scotland advocates supporting Labour just to stop the SNP. So the next time that Labour trot out the argument that a vote for the SNP will get the Tories in power, ask them, why are the Tories actively supporting the Labour Party and not the SNP? The collusion between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, two parties by the way who are supposed to stand in opposition to one another, has led to a situation in Scotland where recent polling shows that Labour may face obliteration at the general election. Scott Goes Pop's poll of polls for the Westminster general election has support for the SNP sitting on 46%, Labour on 26%, the Conservatives on 16%, UKIP on 4% and the Greens on 3%. Unless Labour get it together, they're going to lose most of their seats to the SNP. So what has Jim Murphy, the saviour of Scottish Labour, done so far to try and alleviate this problem? Well, to begin with, he's pulled together a new team around him to try and reach out to Yes voters specifically. The problem is that the team he chose includes some of the most disliked individuals from the referendum campaign. His new Chief of Staff is Blair McDougall, the head of Better Together, and a man who led a campaign that, as he admitted afterwards, was intentionally built around scaremongering. Murphy's new Director of Communications is Susan Dalgetty. Anyone on Twitter during the referendum would no doubt have encountered her at some point. She's known for comparing the SNP to the Oma Bombers and calling them all racists. No doubt one of the many reasons she quickly deleted her old Twitter account following her new appointment in Scottish Labour. The party's new Director of External Engagement is Gregor Poynton, a man best known for a vote-rigging scandal in Falkirk just over a year ago. And to top all that off is John McTiernan, a former special advisor to Tony Blair with a history of abusing staffers, who opposes the living wage and wants to privatise the NHS, end personal care for the elderly and reintroduce tuition fees. This is a man who deliberately incited a race riot in Australia and who referred to all Scots as narrow, Presbyterian and racist. McTiernan is Murphy's new Chief of Staff. For a party looking to reach out to Yes voters and disaffected Labour members, I don't know if they could have chosen a worse team. So get ready for the fear, smear and fraud we can expect from the Scottish Labour Party in the run-up to the general election. But it isn't just Murphy's new team that has people scratching their heads. In the last few weeks, Scottish Labour have been actively stealing policy ideas and taking credit for other groups' work. Throughout the referendum, Scottish Labour consistently spoke out against the idea of an oil fund, with Labour's Ian Gray famously asking, how would an oil fund even be funded? Hint, the answer is in the name. Now that the referendum is over and oil prices are dropping, suddenly they're supporting the idea of an oil fund. The difference is that they are calling it a resilience fund in the hope that nobody notices that it is the exact same thing with a different name. Or maybe we can look at Scottish Labour's stance on fracking, with polls showing that a majority of folk oppose fracking. Legislation to impose a moratorium on the controversial shale gas extraction method was voted on in Westminster, apparently at the request of the Labour Party. During the vote, Jim Murphy wasn't even there. He was too busy at a photo shoot of him playing football to even attend. Meanwhile, nearly all of Scottish Labour abstained from the vote. Yet afterwards, Labour MP Margaret Curran got caught out actively lying by saying she had voted for it, when parliamentary records show she didn't vote at all. The Scottish Government, however, have moved to impose a moratorium on fracking. Meanwhile, the campaign group Independence for Women headed up a campaign to oppose the building of a women's prison in Scotland. When the campaign became popular and gained support, Jim Murphy stepped in and not only claimed that it was his campaign, but that he welcomed Independence for Women's support of his policy. Some of the other pledges coming from Scottish Labour are just bizarre. Another promise recently was to guarantee 1,000 more nurses than whatever the SNP promised. It didn't matter if we actually needed 1,000 more nurses than whatever the SNP pledged, Murphy would deliver it regardless, as part of a bizarre supermarket price drop style of politics where policy is dictated not by what works, but by whatever the other party is doing. They quickly deleted all references to this and are now pretending that they pledged 1,000 more nurses on what we already have. For as long as Scottish Labour continue to promote such reactionary policies, steal the victories of other campaigns and focus on taking petty swipes at the SNP rather than promoting their own ideas, they will continue to lose support in Scotland. Scotland has been represented by a majority of Labour MPs at Westminster since 1959. And in that time, poverty in Scotland has more than doubled. It's because of this approach to politics and these facts that stickers and banners stating "Red Tories out" have started to pop up over Glasgow, a city that has been a Labour stronghold for a long time. But perhaps no longer. Because a lot of people feel betrayed. As many during the referendum said, "I didn't leave the Labour Party. The Labour Party left me." Back in November of last year, University College London published a report citing the EU immigration in the UK had overall contributed over £20 billion in taxes to the economy, but also found that, when looking at records from as far back as 1995, that non-EU migrants had paid less in tax than they had received back in benefits. However, it wasn't quite as simple as that, as this statistic wasn't looking at how much tax had been raised by the migrants prior to 1995, before many of them got old and retired. So, between these two stories, which one do you think the right-wing press in the UK ran with? Of course, the second one. Never mind the overall benefits that immigration has had on the economy. Both the Telegraph and the Daily Mail ran the negative story without the necessary context. So, let's say that you read that and decided to make a complaint to the chair of the Editor's Code of Practice at the Independent Press Standards Committee. You can go right ahead, but the person you're sending your complaint about the Daily Mail to is Paul Dacker, the editor of the Daily Mail. This, combined with the fact that Richard Desmond, the owner of the Daily Express, has reportedly pledged to donate £300,000 to UKIP, does mean that we have a problem in the UK, where a lot of the press are actively hostile towards left-wing politics. The Trade Unions Congress also published a report back in 2013, which found that those most likely to support benefit cuts were those who understood them the least. And with the right-wing press publishing nonsense like this, it's no surprise that people aren't well informed. This is one of the reasons why alternative media has no doubt become so popular recently. One such group to launch a new alternative media site is The Common Wheel, a Scottish think and do tank. A soft launch of their new Common Space platform received over 40,000 views in its first 3 days, with over 60 articles written in that short breadth of time. I caught up with the Common Space team to find out a bit more about what it was all about.
Common Space is a new digital news service which has been launched through the Common Wheel campaign.
Common Space, I think we want Common Space to be helping take the Scottish media in a new direction. The Scottish media has had a reputation of, recently certainly, of being quite kind of almost out of touch or out behind the times. For example, when I worked in London for a media magazine, The Drum, and I covered a lot of what publishers were doing, about the big publishing companies, the kind of counterparts of the Scottish ones in London were doing. And online and digitally, the sort of stuff that they were looking at, when you come back to Scotland, you know that Scotland is just not there. They're not doing that up here.
The purpose of this project is to provide a common space of news and content that lets people know what's happening across the country, updating people on important events around politics and current affairs, and putting it all on the one website. We think this is a great opportunity not just to link all the new movements in Scotland together in terms of media content, but also to influence the national agenda so that other newspapers that have launched like The National or other newspapers that have been running in Scotland for years have new sources of information and stories that they can pick up as well. So it's a way of changing the media through our own site and through influencing how other media in Scotland operates.
So I hope that Common Space from that digital side can really kind of lead the way in doing something very different with the Scottish media and engaging people in a way that they haven't been for years, and hopefully that will then be the catalyst that pushes other publishers and other websites to start diversifying what they do, and we can have a really, really improved media in Scotland, which we badly need.
That's everything from Left Scotland this time. The show will be back in 2 weeks approximately. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. As always, links to everything I've spoken about can be found below. Until next time, get out there folks and get involved.